Hi everyone, welcome. The two bins that you see down here are what I've got in my sights for getting fed today. There are a couple of bins in which we've got European night crawlers. The last time we checked in on these systems 12 days ago, they were 100 days of age. So today, 12 days later, they're 112 days of age. And they're due for their next feeding, which is going to be feeding number 10. So I'm going to get them up on the bench and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. These two systems don't have a great deal of difference in terms of, comparing them to one another, but there is one little minor difference in terms of what's considered to be the population of the two systems. They both started out with just under 2,500 worms, an estimated 2,490 worms in each, and then at some point later, we added a couple hundred more worms to bin number 2, the one we're going to feed next. So that's really, theoretically, the only difference between these two systems. Otherwise, they've been managed and maintained in pretty much identical ways. So we shouldn't see too much difference. Even that difference of just a couple hundred worms relative to a population of almost 3,000 is, hardly worth even mentioning, but whatever. That's the number of worms that we estimated to be in each system at launch and then at the point in time when we added a few worms to bin number 2. So I think for all intents and purposes we could treat these as pretty much identical bins. Perhaps bin number 2 being slightly more populated. You can see there's a good number of leaves here on top. Really nice material that hopefully the worms enjoy having access to. Very similar to the sort of stuff that they'll get out in nature. And I guess the added bonus is that it's underneath all that plastic covering, enabling a lot of the moisture present within the system to remain locked down and recirculating and coming back down onto that top covering of leaves. So I guess the one thing I'm noticing here is that we didn't really have anything to indicate to ourselves where we last fed. Yeah, I just checked the top covering of newspaper. We didn't have a feeding zone indicator. So in most cases it's easy enough to find my way back to where I last fed because my typical approach is just to feed down the middle. Lots of nice castings down here and a great moisture content, almost perfect. I think we're starting to bump into some of this stuff that was placed in here last time when we fed 12 days ago. Alright, what are we dealing with here? I didn't really take a lot of note of what they were fed last time, although I did breeze through the last video. For whatever reason, it didn't really stick with me what they got last time. But one thing I'm sensing the smell of is lime. Right away, as soon as my finger bumped into that lime, I could tell what it was. And you could tell it's not really that popular an item. Perhaps because it's got a certain degree of acidic content, citric acid. Perhaps because, I don't know. Perhaps because it seems like it was kind of wrapped up in that piece of paper towel. So whatever the reason, I don't know. You would think that the moisture content of it would be enough to get the worms to come out in droves for it. But it might take a little while before they actually take an interest in it. This, if you haven't recognized it for what it is a stem of a banana, but it's already falling apart. The worms are doing a great job breaking it down. We've also bumped into a couple of these corn cobs along the way. I've always noticed how the corn cobs get nibbled away on the inside first, and then they break down the rest of it. They really seem to like the inside of it. Or maybe it's not so much that they like it more. Perhaps it's more about how easily they can break it down relative to other materials or other parts of the corn cob, which might be a little bit tougher for them to break down. But they really do seem to make their way through the center of the corn cob pretty quickly in most cases. So, corn cobs have been really popular in my worm bins all summer, but we're now a few weeks into autumn. And I think the season for eating corn is near its end, if not over already. So here we've got a pretty good sized piece of newspaper, possibly a piece of paper that was previously used to just serve as top covering. So we'll just grab all those old pieces of leftover bedding type materials and use them as the foundation for today's feeding. It's always so interesting how you crack open one of these corn cobs and it's just riddled with worms on the inside. There's just tons of worms crammed in there, all trying to get in. Here's another lime. I kind of like the way the lime smells, gotta tell you the truth. Even a couple weeks after being in the worm bin, I assume at some point soon they'll be able to make better use of it, but for now it seems like it might still just be a little bit too harsh for them to deal with in terms of the citric acid content or whatever the case may be. Well, we can't forget that the worms don't live alone in their worm bins. They've got other helper creatures right down to the microscopic level aiding in the breakdown of materials. So at some point, the stuff that we put in here should all eventually get broken down. Some of it's going to take longer than others, and that's a-okay. Lots of really nice castings piling up in here. For a 112-day-old system, it's not too unusual to see that. Alright, I think we're almost ready to feed. The stuff that I've got piled up for them here is actually almost all cauliflower, leaves and stems. And it's quite a bit. So we're going to give them about half so we can leave the other half for the other system. The only thing I'm a little bit, limited on here is bedding. I'm almost wondering if I should just grab a few more of these napkins that I've been using as bedding lately and just throw them in here, because that I have. But my prepared bedding ran out recently and I just haven't had a chance to whip up another batch of it. But it always makes good sense to include bedding in your feedings, so I don't know, I'm just wondering if we could just make do with what we have here already. Perhaps this piece of newspaper that once upon a time was probably just a top covering sheet of newspaper. And then we've also got some of this leafy material that was sitting out on top. Perhaps if we just scrounge up some of that from the outer edges where we positioned it as we opened up the middle, maybe we can just come up with enough bedding type materials and leftovers to create a good foundation for today's feeding. Yeah, there's a pretty good amount of stuff over here. Perhaps today we just don't add any bedding, we just use what's already in here and plop in today's food, but I do want to kind of pile up what I can in order to let today's feeding drop down pretty low, which would allow us to still cover it up at the end. That looks pretty good. So why don't we just come in here with about half of what we allocated for this feeding today. Let's see how much we can squeeze in here. There's a nice bit of stuff in here, but I don't want to use it all. I want to save some for bin number 2, where we expect that there are possibly a slightly greater number of worms waiting to get fed also. And yeah, I just dropped in a bunch of frozen material, possibly in contact with some of the worms that were already in here, but I'm not too worried. I think the worms can do pretty good on their own, just, evading anything that they think is uncomfortable. Well, you know what? I did actually pull out my box of leaves, so maybe we can just sprinkle in a little bit of that as supplementary bedding. And since we kind of used what was floating out on the surface as foundation for today's feeding, perhaps we can sprinkle in a little bit more on the top. This is my worm chow. It's just a combination of pulverized different stuff that I found in the cupboard, be it leaves or grains or whatever it might be. It's kind of a changing recipe based on whatever I've got available at the time. I guess some of these leaves that we just bought over could have been used as foundation for today's feeding, but we kind of missed it. This bin looks really nice, I gotta say. It looks really good. Good numbers of worms, a really nice moisture content. Even though we found some leftovers of this and that, I don't think we were kind of going overboard by adding another feeding today. It did seem like it was due. And even out here on the edges, such nice castings piling up. Not bad for a 112-day-old system. Alright, I'm going to take a peek on this side too before we cover up and move on to bin number 2. Here, wow, the moisture is, I don't know if it's visibly more, but I can feel that it's more as I go through it. And even just the way the stuff seems to be a little bit more sticky and seem to have a more tendency to sort of clump up. It seems like it's a little bit more damp than what we saw on the other side. And that might explain why it also seems like there's just a little bit more of a worm population hanging over there too. Alright, I like the way this system's coming along. Nothing fancy, just, you know, simple feeding, throw in what they're getting and move on. Try to spread out what's already here. And I can't say that I saw anything in here that seemed to be showing as any potential of turning into an issue, except maybe what was over here, maybe a little bit on the damp side, but nothing seemed to me like it was starting to clump together or become anaerobic, so I think we're in good shape over here. Okay, I think before we put things away, I'm going to follow through on my idea from earlier of just taking some of this leafy material to provide the system with a slight top covering of supplementary bedding. I know it's not much, but I think we're okay with just this. Interesting. I guess usually I don't see a lot of stuff adhering to my gloves, but when it's a little bit more damp, like what we saw on this edge, it does happen. But I don't think it's an indication of a problem. I think it's just that particular side was showing a little bit more moisture, which is just fine. I'm not going to sweat it. All right. Let's get these little guys covered up and we'll move on to bin number 2. I guess, you know, if you really wanted to try to treat these as identical bins, even though this one is thought to have a greater number of worms in it, it almost also seems like it's got a slightly lower level in terms of how full the container is. And I guess if you were to try to put one and one together, hey, if you got more worms, you can expect that the material is going to drop down further because they're consuming it more rapidly because there's just more of them, which might be a realistic explanation for why that observation appears to be showing that this bin is a little bit less than the other system. But really, I don't know. Who knows? In a kind of a similar, I guess, outcome, which I don't know. I guess that's what I'm sort of expecting, is to see similar outcomes in both bins that I'm managing very similarly. Here too, I'm seeing some leftovers of the top surface leaves that were laid out here for them. But I don't know. I'm not sure if we saw quite a nice collection of, you know, castings right here beneath the top covering of leaves. Here, this collection of castings looks really nice. And I don't know. Just a population difference of only a couple hundred worms probably wouldn't be enough to explain that big of a difference. Who knows what the reason is? I don't know. Huh. Guess here we've also got a pumpkin stem. And a couple other leftovers I'm sure we're going to bump into. Some corn cobs. Once again with worms hanging out right down the middle of them. Here we've got a corn cob that's already been split in half. Here too we've got some leftover orange napkins from the previous feeding, and I think here too we've got a couple limes. I'm sure we're going to find the other one here too soon. Since if we found 2 limes in bin number 1, it's realistic to expect that we're going to find 2 limes in bin number 2. Pretty cool to see how these corn cobs are getting whittled down, but they always seem to go for the middle portion of it first. That's why it seems unusual sometimes to find the middle portion of it still there, that little inner core of somewhat juicier and softer material. Stuff that you would expect them to chew up and eat up in no time, but it's still showing up as leftovers in here. Let's see, more corn cob, more napkin bits. I guess what I'm looking for is lime number 2. Here's some more corn cob. Yeah, we got a good bit of corn cob floating around in this system. Lots of nice castings surrounding all the material too. Could that be lime number 2? Could it be that they actually burned their way through one of the limes? It seemed like the way the 2 limes in bin number 1 looked. Oh, here we go. I guess we must have just busted it up a little bit, but it does seem like we've got some worms interested in it, unless they just ended up on top of it by chance there for a moment. I was kind of, you know, stirring things around, so I don't want to expose worms to something that they really don't want to be on. I'd really prefer to just see them get at that stuff at their own personal pace. I wouldn't want to force something on them that might not be ready for their consumption quite yet. A good number of leftovers floating around in here, but it's not going to dissuade me from piling in the next feeding. I mean, if a lime is something that's going to take weeks before they can actually eat it, I wouldn't want to deny them of, you know, some faster foods. And all these leaves and stems of the cauliflower they're getting today are things that I classify it all as quick and fast type foods that they're probably going to burn through really quickly. So why don't we begin reconstructing today's feeding. So we had some leftovers, but evidently no large piece of newspaper like we had in bin number 1. That's okay. I'm not going to force consistency between the bins. As much as I like to see it, and as much as I like to know that I can kind of use these 2 bins as a measure of one another's progress, I also don't want to treat it as like something religious or whatever, where you gotta really go crazy out of your way to make sure, oh my goodness, they got an extra piece of newspaper. Let's make sure we compensate for that. I think a best effort approach is probably sufficient. Okay. So really all I did there was try to push the outer edges up a bit to give me room down here in the middle to add today's food. But we'll take a closer look at what's going on there on the outsides, on the outer edges after we plopped in today's feeding. You can see the stuff came out of my freezer because some of it's got frost shaking off of it. It's interesting, even though it's frozen, I could totally sense that this is cauliflower. It's got that scent to it. And I can't remember, did we add grit? I might have been busy talking. But a lot of times I'll add this crushed pulverized eggshell to my feedings, you know, to help them with the breakdown of their foods. But I can't remember if we really added anything else, so we'll just, I guess, leave it at that. And at the end we'll pile in a little bit more leafy material as a top covering. But I really want to see how things on these outer edges look. Things really often do appear really nice on these outer edges somehow. Even though the feedings keep getting placed down the middle in a lot of these systems, the outer edges, for whatever reason, always seem to look really nice. And since they're all often very, you know, densely scattered with bedding material, I mean, no, just castings only, I like to scatter in a little bit of extra, you know, bedding materials or scattered bits of food that are leftovers, just so that it's not purely castings out on the outer edges, so that even though the worms like hanging out there for whatever reason, they've also got some stuff to bump into and nibble on from time to time. So let's see what we could do about sprinkling a little bit of that in over here too. I don't know, all in all, I would say that this system too looks very nice. But would you think that this also has a few hundred more worms than bin number 1? I think it might be visibly more heavily populated just from looking at it. That's kind of my impression, but I could be mistaken. So I think it is accurate to say that bin number 2 does appear to have a greater number of worms living in it. As to why it's a little bit less in terms of, you know, material filling the bin up, I don't know. but I'm not going to worry about it. I think we're in pretty good shape here. Let's get these little guys covered up with some fresh leafy material. We're not going to go overboard. We're going to give them about what we saw in bin number 1. Just a little sprinkling, a little something that we could use as the foundation for the feeding next time. And I think we're more or less done. So let's bring back the top coverings of paper that we had on here. Bring back the plastic coverings and we'll be more or less finished. Alright, good job, wormies. Can't complain. I don't know. I did see a good bit of leftovers in both systems, but to me it seemed like the stuff I was putting in now was just gonna like probably thaw out and be, you know, eaten up in no time. There's all this leafy stuff. It was all part of the stems of the cauliflower, all stuff that I think that they're going to eat pretty quickly. And then they can go back to eating those slow composting foods, such as those corn cobs. Those things take forever, and all the other things that they're working on. So I think we're in good shape here. So that's it for today's video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.